if you've listened to the show before, you may know that Formula One and football are definitely the two sports that I enjoy watching and talking about the most. Looking at it, there's similarities between F1 and NFL that show why I like it and why it makes sense that I like both of them. There's the initial similarities where, for the most part, both the Grand Prix in F1 and the games in the NFL are centered around the weekend, which provides a really nice structure for a fan. And both sports have a very manageable amount of games and events to watch. There's 17-game regular season for the NFL and a 22-race season for F1. So the season calendar is very digestible and manageable from a fan's perspective. For example, I have little interest in the NBA's regular season, to be honest, because there's just too many games. And I have practically no interest in the MLB's regular season with 162. I'll watch the postseason for both, though. I think the real impressive thing, though, about the NFL is the parity found in the league. I think they're the gold standard in that regard. There's no clear favorites or super teams when you come into the start of a season. The Kansas City Chiefs were probably the closest thing to that, to a super team, with their stacked offense, and they've only won one title and have since been broken up, basically, with the Tyreek Hill trade. Formula One is starting to adopt some rules that remind me of what the NFL does to ensure fairness and entertainment simultaneously. And there's three main ways that F1 is starting to look like the NFL that I want to focus on. For the NFL fans listening, do you remember when there was a proposal where instead of an onside kick to get the ball back after a touchdown, you could run a 4th and 15 play to get the ball back? That's what's great about the NFL. Not that rule didn't get instituted, not that rule, but that they're willing to experiment. They're always willing to change the rules to make a more entertaining product in a way that is still fair. For example, they moved back the extra point to make it more difficult and encourage teams to go for 2-point tries more often. They experimented with being able to challenge pass interference calls, which didn't work, but they tried. They tried the experiment. The point is they're willing to experiment and innovate. And F1 is doing the same thing, and they have done the same thing. The F1 and FIA powers that be wanted closer racing with these new regulations, and they delivered. Through 4 races, every team has scored a point, which is the earliest in a season that this has occurred. F1, they now hold sprint races occasionally. And finally, because of these new regulations, we have an exciting sprint race at the front in Imola, which was awesome. Cars can follow now. On-track battles can be sustained across multiple laps, which we saw in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. In Bahrain, Leclerc and Max battled wheel-to-wheel for 3 laps, which as a newer fan, I had hardly seen before, a wheel-to-wheel battle that would sustain for that long. So number one, both leagues are willing to experiment with the game rules in order to create a more entertaining product. That's a really good thing. Now I actually want to bring baseball into this to illustrate an important difference between how F1 used to operate and how it's going to start operating more like the NFL. The NFL, they have a hard salary cap. There's a set limit each year, and if teams exceed it, the NFL can void contracts, veto trades, fine the team, and even deduct draft picks, so on. In contrast, let's look at a league like the MLB, which has no salary cap. It has a competitive balance tax, which taxes rich teams when they spend above a certain limit. But in the MLB, you can outspend teams. And the Yankees and Dodgers, they regularly do. But you don't see the Yankees and Dodgers winning every year because the nature of baseball is unpredictable. The best player on your team, they may only get 4 at-bats. You can't have your best player bat every single time. And therefore, baseball is one of the worst sports in terms of measuring skill level. And it leaves a lot of room for luck. That's why they play 162 games, to try and minimize the effect of luck in the standings. But when it comes to the postseason, baseball again becomes essentially bad at measuring skill because the sample size shrinks down again to a best-of-7 series. In fact, there was a 2013 paper from the Harvard Sports Analysis, which sounds very smart, obviously, found that the MLB most consistently produces champions most disparate from their regular season performance. In other words, the MLB produces the most undeserving champions. And since there's no postseason really in F1, every race is basically the postseason. Formula One results do not have the same unpredictability that a baseball game has, meaning the sport does a better job at measuring the skill of a manufacturer and the skill of a driver than baseball does at measuring the skill of their players. Sure, you can have a crash with an unruly driver or an engine failure, but good drivers, they avoid the scraps over the course of the season. Good manufacturers, they make cars that are consistently quicker over one lap, and they make cars that are consistently quickest over 40 to 60 laps in a race. They make cars that don't break down. So F1 is a sport that is good at measuring the skill of each team and measuring who can make the best car. And over the last decade or so, the best car went to the teams that spend the most. I mean, that's how you make a good machine, is you spend a lot of money. So all of this is to say is that in Formula One, you can outspend other teams and buy wins in a way, and that's why an unlimited budget doesn't work in F1 where it would work in baseball, because baseball doesn't measure skill that well. Doesn't mean that the players aren't skilled, the game just doesn't measure the skill of their players that well. The cost cap, therefore, is a step in the right direction. I mean, I don't watch European soccer leagues, but I always hear complaints about teams being able to just buy wins in that league. And that's not fun for anyone. The general sentiment is that the smaller teams in F1 had been operating at the same budget level that the cap is going to be set at for a while now, while basically Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes will have to scale back to stay within the budget demands. And the way the cap works is the cap governs most things that relate to car performance. Capital expenditures are also monitored, so teams can't constantly upgrade their facilities. There are going to be exclusions, of course. Driver salaries are not part of the cost cap. The salaries of the 3 highest paid personnel are also exempt. That way teams can retain high-profile engineers or strategists. Marketing costs are exempt. Team travel is exempt so that they don't cut costs on flying their team and nice accommodations. Power unit developments as well, engine developments are also excluded because smaller teams don't need to spend that money on developing their own engines, so it balances that part out, which the top teams do take more of a burden on. And finally, the good thing about the cost cap is it's part of the reason why Audi and Porsche right now are interested in entering F1 is because it's more sustainable financially. And more engine variety is great for competition, branding, popularity. So in short, F1's cost cap is now looking more similar to how the NFL uses a salary cap in a way to enforce parity. Finally, and this is my favorite parallel, I'll ask you a question first. What is the most fundamental way that an American sports league tries to help struggling teams catch up? It just happened this week for the NFL. It's the draft. In the NFL, if you're the Jaguars and you go 2-15 or 0-17, the next year you get the first overall pick. And you won't see that change in the very next year, but that accumulation of talent, getting the first pick at the start of every round, means you're going to have better players you should have better players comparatively, right? And we saw it turn around in 2 years, right, with the Bengals, so it can't happen. What is F1's counterpart for the NFL draft? It's the wind tunnel and CFD time. The wind tunnel is basically where you put a model car on a conveyor belt in a tunnel. A big fan blows wind to simulate a car moving through air in real life. It's to measure aerodynamics and how well your car does on that. With new regulations now, the worst team in the constructor standings get the most wind tunnel time, and the best team from the previous season gets the least wind tunnel time. And the same applies to the CFD time, which is computational fluid dynamics. I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically it's a virtual wind tunnel, and they use computer-aided design models of their F1 car to make small aerodynamic changes and see how that would affect how air moves through it. Like I said about NFL draft picks, you're not going to see this change in one season. Mostly. The Jaguars, they drafted Trevor Lawrence last year. They're still bad. F1's head of aerodynamics, Jason Somerville, echoed a pretty similar sentiment when talking about the wind tunnel regulations. He said, will it level the playing field over the course of a season? Probably not. but over the course of a few seasons, it's very unlikely you will not see a closing of the grid. And this is exactly how the draft works. I love it because it's not a free win. Like, NFL teams still need to draft well, and F1 teams still need to efficiently use their extra wind tunnel time. But I think it's already worked. Like, the two worst teams last year in Alfa Romeo and Haas are enjoying a nice little resurgence. They're actually in the fight. Ferrari are also enjoying an advantage over Red Bull and Mercedes by virtue of their really terrible 2020 campaign and third place last year, while Red Bull and Mercedes were battling for the title. In summary, if we're looking at all of this together now, F1 looks more like the NFL in like three important ways. They're willing to experiment with the game's rules. Both leagues do that. They both have a hard budget cap now to prevent the buying of championships, essentially. And they both give the worst teams a boost to close the gap via either a high draft pick in the NFL or more wind tunnel and CFD time in F1. And the impressive part about F1's moves, too, is that F1 is a unique sport in that the tension between entertainment and innovation is much higher in F1 than sports that don't use machines, like football obviously does not use machines. In order to promote the interest of sporting fairness and entertainment, sometimes innovation may actually be lost. And make no mistake about it, like F1 is going to be for entertainment first. But in these new regulations, there were worries that the regulations were going to be too prescriptive, but the variety in car designs has shown that innovation and entertainment can coexist. And as a fan, I definitely hope that continues. Thank you for watching and listening. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Another thing you could do is listen to our full Lunch Pail Guys podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and SoundCloud. We cater to the hybrid F1 football fan on our Pit Stop series. That's the series this section is from. And we release episodes every Tuesday and Thursday about all other sports. Thank you.